This is Land of Havilah, Leviticus 19. In this chapter, Yahweh will be switching subjects almost every verse from one short law to another. Verse 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and tell them, You shall be holy, for I, Yahweh your God, am holy. Comment, the laws in this chapter might seem to come randomly from all directions, but they do have a common theme in verse 2, which is, You shall be holy, for I am holy. Getting into the specifics, verse 3, Each one of you shall respect his mother and his father. You shall keep my Sabbaths. I am Yahweh your God. Don't turn to idols, nor make molten images for yourselves. I am Yahweh your God. Comment, that was similar to 3 of the 10 commandments. Honor your father and mother, don't make idols, and keep my Sabbaths, meaning not just the 7th day of the week, but also the high holy days such as Passover and the Day of Atonement. Christians are free to recognize the Sabbath or not recognize one, Romans 14:5. We shouldn't cast judgment on anyone who does or does not recognize the Sabbath or any holy day, Romans 14:10. Verse 5, When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to Yahweh, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it or on the next day, and if anything remains until the 3rd day, it shall be burned with fire. If it's eaten at all on the 3rd day, it's an abomination. It will not be accepted. But everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he's profaned the holy thing of Yahweh, and that soul shall be cut off from his people. Comment, a peace offering was the type of offering that the Israelite took most of it back to his lodgings for feasting, or he could give it away, such as occasionally when some of the kings offered thousands of peace offerings and fed the people with them. Yahweh says, Eat a peace offering the same day or the next day. On the 3rd day, burn the leftovers. Obviously, Yahweh doesn't want anyone to associate him with spoiled meat. That would be a mockery or an abomination, as he put it in verse 7. Verse 9, When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not glean your vineyard, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the foreigner. I am Yahweh your God. Comment, to reap in a field of grain means to cut the standing stalks with a sickle. Then they would bind the stalks into bundles and take them on to the next step, which was threshing. To glean means to go back through the field and pick up the loose stalks that you missed when you were reaping. Yahweh says, don't be that stingy. Don't glean your fields at all. Leave the poor to come in and glean them. And don't reap the corners of your fields. They're for the poor also, and the fallen grapes are for the poor. Gather your grapes only one time and leave the rest for the poor. Just leave them there. This law didn't apply to Israel at the time Yahweh gave it because they were in the desert and had no crops. It'll only apply when they take possession of the promised land. But the principle of this law still applies at all times. Don't be stingy. Be considerate to the poor, not with handouts necessarily, but let them work a little bit for themselves in your fields. In Exodus 23:11, Yahweh gave another commandment concerning the poor coming onto a person's land. He said, Let your fields rest and lie fallow every 7th year. This included the olive groves and vineyards. The produce that grew by itself every 7th year would be for the poor to come in and gather, or for the wild animals. Now for some very basic principles, verse 11. You shall not steal. You shall not lie. You shall not deceive one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely and profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. You shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am Yahweh. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor show favoritism to the great, but you shall judge your neighbor in righteousness. You shall not go up and down as a slanderer among your people. You shall not endanger the life of your neighbor. I am Yahweh. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. Comment, everything we just read falls under the category of love your neighbor as yourself. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you won't steal, lie, or deceive in verse 11, swear to him falsely in verse 12, oppress, rob, or hold back his wages in verse 13. In verse 14, don't curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. The deaf can't hear the curse, and the blind can't see the stumbling block. It goes past the deaf and blind and extends to anyone who's unaware. Don't take advantage of anyone who's unaware of something. As one of many examples, if you're dealing with someone who doesn't understand the mathematics of an interest rate and how it's going to negatively impact him, don't rob him with high interest rates. He's blind to what it'll do to him. In verse 15, show no partiality to the poor or great. If we're on a jury, we might feel sorry for the poor guy and side with him, or we might let the rich guy bribe us, or we might respect the rich guy so that we side with him. We should love them both and side with the one who's in the right. In verse 16, don't go up and down telling lies about people and changing subjects. Don't endanger anyone's life. Keep everything as safe as possible. No recklessness. In verse 17, rebuke a person but don't hate. Set the person straight if they're in the wrong. If you don't set him straight, God will charge it to you. Quote, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. End quote. In verse 18, don't take vengeance. Don't bear a grudge. And in summary, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said in Matthew 22 that 2 laws summed up all the law. The first, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second one is in verse 18 we just read, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So it's do right by God and by your fellow man. Verse 19, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not crossbreed different kinds of animals. Comment, that one makes us think twice about genetic engineering, where we take a gene or set of genes from one species and splice them into the DNA of another species. Quote, you shall not crossbreed different kinds of animals, end quote. Still in verse 19, you shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. Don't wear a garment made of 2 kinds of material. Comment, these are head scratchers to us because there doesn't seem to be any moral violation in commingling different crops in the same field or mixing materials by fashioning a garment, say, of 35% polyester and 65% cotton. Yahweh's reasoning escapes us here, but there's something here about purity. Verse 20, if a man lies carnally with a woman who's a slave girl, pledged to be married to another man and not ransomed or given her freedom, they shall be punished. They shall not be put to death because she was not free. He shall bring his trespass offering to Yahweh to the door of the tent of meeting, even a ram for a trespass offering. The priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering before Yahweh for his sin which he's committed, and the sin which he's committed shall be forgiven him. Comment, as we said, some of this didn't apply to Israel at the time because they didn't have crops, but now we've come on something that doesn't apply to us because, for one reason, we don't have slaves. In verse 20, basically, a man shouldn't take advantage of a slave girl. She's in a vulnerable position. If she has a fiancé and her master lies with her, society should impose some type of negative consequence to both of them. Quote, they shall be punished, end quote. Yahweh left it open as to what the punishment should be. If they have sex, he owes it to her to marry her, assuming her fiancé rejects her and she's willing to marry. Verse 23. When you come into the land and have planted all kinds of trees for food, then you shall count their fruit as forbidden. 3 years they shall be forbidden to you. It shall not be eaten. But in the 4th year all its fruit shall be holy for giving praise to Yahweh. In the 5th year you shall eat its fruit, that it may yield its increase to you. I am Yahweh your God. Comment, in other words, don't eat fruit from a tree until the 5th year. In the 4th year the fruit on display gives praise to Yahweh. Verse 26. You shall not eat any meat with the blood still in it. You shall not use enchantments nor practice sorcery. You shall not cut the hair on the sides of your head or clip off the edge of your beard. Comment, verse 27 about the hair and beard must have lost something in translation because it's not clear in any English translation what Yahweh's talking about. Is he saying no haircuts or beard trimming at all? Or is he saying don't trim certain parts of the hair and beard? It can't be no haircuts at all because haircuts were the norm. 2 Samuel 14:26. Verse 28. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am Yahweh. Comment, no cutting the body for the dead and no tattoos. Why? Because I am Yahweh. We have to keep saying the law of Moses in general as it applies to Christians is a little complicated. Some of it applies and some doesn't. The New Testament repeats some of the law and applies it to us. For example, honor your father and mother, Ephesians 6:2. But as far as the entire law of Moses is concerned, quote, you are not under the law but under grace, Romans 6:14. Verse 29. Don't profane your daughter to make her a prostitute, lest the land fall to prostitution and the land become full of wickedness. Comment, prostitution is wicked. Verse 30. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am Yahweh. Don't turn to those who are mediums, nor to wizards. Don't seek them out to be defiled by them. I am Yahweh your God. You shall rise up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear your God. I am Yahweh. If a stranger lives as a foreigner with you in your land, you shall do him no wrong. The stranger who lives as a foreigner with you shall be to you as the native born among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you lived as foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. Comment in verses 33 and 34, resident foreigner is Hebrew ger. It comes from the same root as the verb to live. He lives in the land. He's taken up residence among you. Yahweh says, treat him as native born and love him as yourself. Verse 35, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in measures of length, of weight, or of quantity. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe all my statutes and all my ordinances, and do them. I am Yahweh. Comment, an ephah is about 1/3 of a bushel, and a hin's about a gallon. Yahweh says, don't cheat anybody with a short measure. From the New Testament, quote, now before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned, until the coming of faith would be revealed. Galatians 3:23. Leviticus 20 is next.